Right. Good morning and welcome, everyone. Welcome back to those that were here last week, and welcome to those who are here today. I see some familiar faces and colleagues of mine. I see Vanessa Woods, who's down in the San Diego area. Hey, Nessa. Stephanie Joseph, who's I think over there in Berkeley. My old colleague, Kim San Gabriel. Hey, Kim. I haven't seen her in so long since I stopped working at Family Paths and then renting office space there. So good to see you. Wow. And others. I see so many others who were here last week. Welcome back. All right. So in the chat box, Leah has shared actually the resources from last week and this week. The recording from last week is available on the First Five YouTube page, so check that out if you haven't. They're doing a great job of archiving everything that they've been offering pretty much since the beginning of the pandemic is when everything pivoted. And I think Leah's doing a fantastic job at training us at First Five, making sure everything is archived there with resources for continued learning. And I'm always excited about those who go there to watch again, or folk who can't make it and they go there to watch. We pay attention to the numbers, so thank you all for showing that it's actually meaningful. Okay, so again, I'm having monitor problems like last week for those who were here. So some of the text will look a little different on your end, but it will look the way it was supposed to in your slide deck, because Leah is, the slide was created in PowerPoint for Mac and it's being projected for PowerPoint for PC. So it's messing up the fonts a little bit. So welcome to part two. We've named this Family Engagement, Our Role and Responsibility, the Trauma Staircase, So I'm Shawn Bryant. For those who don't know, I'm going to be your facilitator on this learning journey. So welcome. Just a little bit about me on the slide. Those are my guy kids you see behind me. That's Shola, Buhai, and Madison there. Well, I was telling Catherine, she was asking me when was the next time I was going to see them, and I was telling her I'm actually going to see them next week. And the middle child, who's over my shoulder, when I show up, she always says, "Where are we going?" Because they believe their job is to simply spend my money. But love them. They keep me young. For those who don't know, I like to just share with folks things that guide me in this work. I've been doing this work over 30 years in a variety of capacities: preschool teacher, center director, education and disabilities manager, early childhood mental health consultant, to name a few, statewide TNTA specialist, statewide analysts, just a bunch of different roles within early childhood, fatherhood coordinator. Wow, that was 27 years ago. But these are the pieces that, for me, resonate deeply, and they show up everywhere I go and inside of everything I do. I want you to pay attention to all of them, but most importantly, I always like to spotlight this one at the bottom around play. I think that we still have multiple opportunities for those who work with young children in a variety of capacities to really understand play more, to understand how play shifts and pivots for different children in different cultures, and how do we make that accessible and available to them, and for us to really unpack our role and responsibility as facilitators, and more importantly, the discomfort that we have with play that we don't like to articulate. And for those who are on social media, I want to encourage you to show up there if you are, and see what I am up to, and tell me. I'm at that place now where I'm using a little bit more and responding to what people are wanting to hear and see. Of course, in this virtual learning process, we're going to raise awareness around being trauma responsive in terms of family engagement and build on what we've kind of learned last week. We're going to learn some new skills here, mainly around the brain and what happens between adults. And then we're going to ask that you reflect on those pieces of information that are new to you around the big $20 word that Dr. Bruce Perry uses is state-dependent functioning. So we're going to spend some time with that. Then, of course, we're pulling from the book. So we're going to highlight some of the principles and practices from the book. So this is that time where I encourage you to get pen and paper for this virtual learning experience. And I want to encourage you on that pen and on that paper that you grab, or that dry erase board, whatever you're writing on, I want you to write some words at the top. I want you to write at the top of that paper the word memory or memories. What memories surface for you during this short learning experience? What feelings or thoughts surface for you during this learning experience? What connections are you making during this learning experience? And the fourth one, which is probably the easiest for most people if you follow neuroscientists in terms of the brain's development from the bottom up. What time do you experience a discomfort or levels of feeling uncomfortable or discomfort? So I want you to have those big four frames, but other things that pop up for you, definitely write them down. Questions, write them down. But instead of attempting to write what I'm saying, and anyone that's been to one of my sessions knows that everything that you need is in the slide, really. I do it that way on purpose so that you can engage a little bit differently with yourself, kind of developing some reflexivity while this is happening. All right. So I encourage you to stay engaged that way. So of course, I've created those community agreements for how you can take back this information as an overarching goal, but also meet that take back with how you showed up with your role and responsibility around family engagement in the 21st century. Of course, we're using the chat box, but remember we use the chat box to stay on topic and to not offer or sell other things or answer other folks' questions in the way that could get internalized as you're telling me what to do. So just be mindful of that, but we want to encourage you to use the chat box to share out as it comes up for you. Maybe memories that come back that are appropriate to share, thoughts and feelings, questions. Definitely use the chat box so that we could all learn together. And anyone that has come to anything that I do know that I encourage you to unmute and bring your voice into the Zoom early and often. So just like last week, we won't be having any breakout rooms just because they're impossible to manage and because of the nature of this topic. We're really not wanting to create any types of traumas for people throughout this training. And because we can't monitor them all, we're just going to stay together. And of course, as you found out last week, last week's session really came from chapter 1. Today's session is folded into aspects of chapter 2 and some other chapters around state-dependent functioning and principles that are inside of trauma-responsive family engagement in early childhood. And of course, sorry about that. In full disclosure, all the proceeds from trauma-responsive family engagement have gone to and will continue to go to Parent Voices Oakland. Yeah, each one of the books in this series, we pick a different early childhood agency and donate everything to them. Thank you for sharing that link in the chat, Catherine. Appreciate that. She placed the link for all of their first 5 archived PDs are right there. So there are two videos here that kind of lead the way. One we're going to show today and one we're not going to show. But I will give Leah the link. I just realized I neglected to give you the link to this, Leah, but it is on YouTube. It's Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and where he's talking about how our bodies remember. He's the author of the book, The Body Keeps Score. Some great information. Some people have some contentious with them. I try not to police people that way, but there were some alleged allegations. And so some people in the Greater Bay Area was like, we don't use him anymore. That's not why I'm not showing the video. It's because it's actually longer. I think it is actually a really great video. It's short, succinct, and it offers a lot for people. But there's another video that I will be sharing today.
The most
by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. And I introduced her name to some of you last week, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. So she's written 2 books that I have. And you can find her on YouTube if you Google her name. But here's a video, it's about 5 minutes and 30 seconds, where she answers this question on the screen. What is trauma and where does it live? What is trauma and where does it live? So I want to anchor us in today's session with Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett in this short snippet of a longer talk that she provided. So if you are seated in your office, this might be the best time to put your headset on, cut your volume up so that you can hear. And as always, we're answering those questions that are at the top of our piece of paper around memories that surface, questions that come, thoughts and feelings, or even if we feel uncomfortable. And then we'll talk about the video afterwards.
We have a lot of words for unpleasant experiences. We can call it negative mood, we can call it stress, we can call it trauma. All of these words have something in common, and what they have in common is they all refer to events that are really metabolically expensive. Trauma, it's an experience that is constructed like any other experience is constructed. That doesn't trivialize it. That just shows you the real power of predictions in the economy of your everyday life. What's happening when an adverse experience becomes traumatic, the brain is weighting that experience very heavily in its future predictions. From a metabolic standpoint, it's always better to predict and correct than it is to react. The traumatic event is re-experienced again and again and again, which only strengthens those connections and only makes those predictions more likely in the future. And the reason why a brain would do this is to avoid missing a threat. The brain is building a model of the world as a threatening place, and it's constantly preparing the body to deal with that over and over and over again. And then the brain continues to make those predictions, continues to model that world, and hasn't updated itself. This idea that trauma lives in your body, or that your body somehow carries with it the mark of trauma. It's based on this idea that you have this animalistic part of a brain, and that this somehow leads to adversity, trauma, marking your body, and you feeling the consequences of the trauma in your body. And then treatments are designed to remove those marks from your body. And it turns out that many of the treatments that I'm familiar with actually do show really good evidence of working, but they don't work because you have a cockroach brain or a lizard brain, and they don't work because trauma is marking your body. Your body does not keep the score. Your brain keeps the score, and your body is the scorecard. Your experience of your body is actually constructed and experienced in your brain. Your body isn't what needs to be healed. What needs to change is your brain's predictions, because those predictions are what construct your experience of your body in the world. And you have to find a way to break that cycle. You are not trapped in traumatic predictions. It is possible to change with a number of different methods. The kind of dominant treatments for trauma, like yoga, the use of psychedelics, and sometimes dance therapy or something embodied like theater, those are all really good ways of altering your predictions. Partly what you're doing is creating new experiences for yourself to flesh out and make more flexible your brain's ability to predict differently in the future. You could describe the brain as a scientist, a scientist with a hypothesis. That's what a set of predictions are. It's a belief, a guess about what sensations are about to happen and why they happen. That's where those emotions come from. And so like a good scientist, you could test and see which hypothesis is the correct one. That is something that when you're recovering from trauma, it's really important to do, because the arousal that you might feel might have something to do with your uncertainty about which category is the right one, and the only way to figure that out is to get more information. Some people might be concerned that what I'm saying is that trauma is in your head, and I am saying trauma is in your head, but everything is in your head. Every beautiful sunset that you see, every hug that you feel, every delicious drink that you have, everything is in your head. It is possible to recover from trauma. That doesn't mean that traumatic memories won't rear their ugly heads at some time in the future, but they don't have to dominate your brain's predictions. And the fact that you have some control over how to manage that content is a gift.
All right, let's pause there. That was the end of the video before I move to the next slide. So just think for about 30 seconds. Let's hear from a few people. What came up for you in terms of memories, thoughts and feelings, comfort, discomfort, questions? Did this make sense? Did it confuse you?
May I?
Hey, Kim, go ahead.
Hey there. I found it really interesting. It definitely pushed against some of my current training. Like I'm about to actually help facilitate the Finding Peace Within group, the trauma group for women. You probably remember that.
Mhm.
And so I found myself going, what? But I continued to listen. I kept the prefrontal cortex, engaged. And
All
I
right.
think I get what she's saying. Like, there's a focus on like trauma stored in the body, which I still am going to hold on to, but I get that it's really the brain and how the brain's holding what happened to you and thinking about what's going to happen to you in the future,
Mhm.
and it's like, that's really where possibly the challenge is. And I was hoping to hear maybe a little hint as to from her, like, well, okay, so what are you thinking of doing differently than what we're currently doing, with all the body focused treatments, the bottom up. So she's suggesting a top down or a bottom up and a top down. Anyway, that's kind of where my brain went. But
Awesome. Thank you, Kim. Thank you. I appreciate the fact that you were caught in that space. Like, wait a minute, when
yeah.
we hear information that's different than what we hold, which was my experience. Then she started saying things that I was like, I like this. I
Right.
like this. And she had some current research. Like, she also, I see you're next, Lorna. She talks about the notion of when we talk about the basic feelings that are global amongst all communities. she unpacked the research and said, you know, that wasn't really researched. There were 6 men who went in the room and said, these are the ones that we're going to name. So I was just like, wait a minute. You know how many teachers and parents and people I've trained about around like the basic feelings and emotions that we're supposed to teach young children. And what she said was actually didn't happen that way, which made me lean in differently because now I was curious, but it was like, there are videos on First Five's YouTube page where I'm saying, here are those universal ones. And she's telling me people made them up. So it was like, okay, I had to contend with that. Like people made it up and we're pushing it. So that made me lean in, Kim, and buy both of her books because I was like, okay, she's brave and she's presenting in a different way and not going with status quo, which is why I wanted to introduce her to this group. But thank you for contending with where your push-pull was, but still being available to say, I'm going to pull through and listen. I think she has a lot of unique, not just perspective, but research-based information that helps us to see things differently. Lorna?
Yeah, Shawn, this made me think, you know, just thinking about everything that we know about trauma. And, you know, she said at one point, trauma, our brains are wired to start looking for trauma, you know, and you know, it makes sense that we're trying to protect ourselves. And so now, you know, if a child's experience is loud voices, is going to be the beginning of something that may be chaotic, that may be unsafe. When they're in the classroom and the noise starts, they're responding to it like it was a violent situation in their home. Mm-hmm. And so, but we don't know that. And so just thinking about that, you know, made me think. And then, she brought in, you know, yoga and all these other things that can kind of counteract that. And so what is so important about, you know, putting those things into our daily routine is going to be really important when we don't know what the child's experience has been. So.
Thank you for the corner, definitely. And I often say, and I mentioned this somewhat last week, we don't always need to know. It's our response that is the most important piece, that when we start digging, we end up still confused. So the word, and I didn't put it in this one in particular, Lorna, or in last week's, because I felt like it's a part, like most people are used to the basic 3, fight, flight, freeze, in terms of trauma responses. Last week, I introduced the notion of fawning, which really is that please, appease kind of state. But there are some others, and they all begin with F. So the one that we often see with young children is called flocking. And it often happens in early childhood settings. They're at circle time, you know, in your program, and little Johnny won't sit down. Every time at circle, he gets up and he moves, and the teacher says, sit back down. And then she finally gets him to articulate in this way where he says, do you hear that? And she thinks, there's nothing to hear. And she says, no, Johnny, I don't hear that. But then every day he's getting up and he's moving and he's running and he's trying to get close to her. That's flocking. Our response when she says, no, Johnny, I don't hear that. My response is, that's not a trauma responsive teacher, because simply changing our language and our entry point helps us understand Johnny's going through something and he can't articulate it all. But if I say, what do you hear, Johnny? Tell me about it. That's that simple shift that many of us on this call would say, well, that was way simplistic. But that shift for many of us as adults is difficult, because if I've been trained and modeled not to respond that way, and I have to relearn that I could simply say, what did you hear as a response? Or what did you feel, right? Or what did you see? When children are experiencing things in their own lives that are real for them, but not real for us, the leaning, that flocking, because what they're looking for is what the resource they're dealt to connect to. So when I say, think of animals that flock together. When we flock together, there's safety in that, right? So when the adult says, I didn't see that, I didn't hear that, I didn't feel that, then their child is attempting to flock or connect. The adult says, nope, nope, and it pushes the child back into that situation. So I heard you talking a little bit about that, Lorna. So you just reminded me of that. So I wanted to share it. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Lorna, and thank you, Kirsten, in the chat. So a big piece that I wanted everybody to get from what she says is she's talking about our nervous system. And this is one of the things that is in her book, and I've heard her say. She says, the best thing for your nervous system is another human being, and the worst thing for your nervous system is another human being. So of course, when I was presented with this, I thought, well, wait a minute. Okay. And young children and families have to be in community, we have to be around other human beings. And some people can take this literally and say, well, then we're not going to be around other people. You know, sometimes that is the reaction from folk, that I'm just not going to be around you, when in essence, we have to be around other people to live and to thrive. It is a necessary part of a human condition. But the shift here is how we affect each other's nervous system, right? And when we come to this consciousness as people who service families with young children or service adults, and I know many people on the call do that, when we can ready ourselves for how we show up and how we present, that we have an effect on their nervous system. And then vice versa, how do we be in control? So what I mean by vice versa, I always caution adults, parents, and teachers and caregivers alike, when children are in their tornado or their storm, it's so easy for us to get pulled into the storm. But if I can resist being pulled into the storm and help them connect to what I call my calm, then I become the best thing for their nervous system. But if I get pulled in, then I become what? A negative experience for their nervous system. The same thing happens with adults. The same thing. Last week, I gave some short stories around adults who showed up where their nervous systems were activated negatively. And my response was the opposite, so that I helped them to connect to me in this way that it became an effective and positive thing instead of a negative thing. The other thing here around this nervous system and the brain that Dr. Feldman Barrett is talking about, she presents this idea around new feelings. So I want you to hold on to this around what happens in our brains. This notion of new feelings. So when your synapses fire and they create those experiences, and every time we do the same thing over, it gets strengthened and strengthened and strengthened. Now, what happens when it gets strengthened is that could be a positive or negative experience. So when we come to that place of, whoa, that was a negative experience that I don't want to have anymore, and we replace that negative experience with a positive experience, it ultimately wires right on top of it. Here's what happens. Most people think, oh, that negative one got pruned. That's not what pruning means. It's still there. And most of us, when we're not really well regulated, we're having a difficult time, maybe we didn't eat the right things, or we didn't eat at all, and we're in that elevated state, that new one gets pushed to the side, and that old one says, I need to take over. I need to take over, as if it's saying, I'm the older one, I'm the most primitive, I need to keep us safe, right? Because we know that the bottom of the brain is the oldest part of the brain. So in those situations, parents, children, teachers, caregivers, sometimes the bottom of the brain begins to lead the way. But because the best thing for our nervous system is another adult, we can help them connect to calm and start to create those new feelings. That was a big message that she sends, which is why I said, she has so much to put in there, but I needed to put that in there, because when we're working with parents and families, particularly the ones that may be challenging, or sometimes we don't understand what their needs and wants are, or they appear to be not participating, if we can remind ourselves that on the other level, they're responding and we're responding to each other's nervous systems, in the way that's often unnamed, we can rethink this and show up and do things differently, which is why I wanted to share this as just part, a small part of what she has to offer. So as we move into pulling from the book now. So inside the book, we quote Dr. Bruce Perry. So this statement on the screen where he says, trauma responsive practice is guided by an understanding of the neurobiology of stress and trauma. So essentially, Dr. Perry calls this state-dependent functioning. State-dependent functioning. So when we think of this notion, this kind of $20 term, state-dependent functioning, it's about us always changing. It's always changing. So the arousal continuum, or as I like to sometimes say, this arousal staircase that we see here on the screen is really about our state of emotions and stress that moves up and down that arousal continuum or staircase throughout the day. When we move up that continuum, our stress response system is activated. Now I'm using the word activated because it's the word most people are used to. But when you dig deep into, I have some friends who are in the medical field, and I know Catherine, who is a nurse, they'll tell you this, that we often only use the word activated in the negative way, but we can be activated positively also. So I just want to say that as a word of caution, because when people hear activation, what I'm hearing is most of us attribute it to being negatively activated in terms of a trauma response. So in that stress response or activation, when we start to move up, we get close to what the literature calls hyperarousal. And that hyperarousal is oftentimes that fight or flight response, right? Or hypoarousal, which they call the freeze or the fawn response, those other two. But we can also move down the continuum, right? Where our stress response is less activated negatively, right? Here's where we get closer to, see that word on the screen, connecting to calm. And oftentimes for parents and families that we work with, or young children, or even teachers and educators, they need to connect to a person's calm to help them reach that state. So this is about us thinking clearer in many respects. And as Kim she said earlier, that prefrontal cortex, the youngest part of the brain, but that's where logical thinking, clear thinking happens. And when we make logical decisions and solve problems, when we're at the bottom of that staircase. So our brains are always taking an input from everything, from our senses, what we hear, what we see, touch, feel, taste, and perceive. So on my mother's side of the family, actually it's both sides, because I'm the eldest grandchild paternally and maternally. I'm going to have a lot of female cousins, and most of their names begin with SHA. Yeah, y'all can judge us later. But I was telling on my mother's side, the cousin that literally is 3 years younger than me, and our youngest cousin. So I'm old enough to be her father. And I have completely different relationships with them. So oftentimes when they're having difficulties, they both call me. So I'm hearing both versions of the story. So I was explaining to both of them separately that their perceptions of each other is their reality, regardless of what the other person says. So what I perceive to be a threat, no matter what you do, I'm still holding on to that perception of you being a threat, right? So if that young child perceives that assistant teacher to be a threat, they're holding on to that. They're holding on to that. If that family perceives their interaction with that family advocate or that center director or that, family specialist or that treatment specialist to be a threat, they hold on to that. They can work around it and through it, but it affects their internal states because it's bringing, their past experiences in terms of trauma. And those past experiences can take us and parents or families to what I call a sunken place. So we've got to really, really be mindful of the impressions that we're leaving with our families, those who are vulnerable and those who are across the continuum don't have those types of vulnerabilities, right? Here's why. Everybody's internal systems are always monitoring the external environment. It's the bottom part of our brain. It's the part of the brain that kept our ancestors alive, that said, scan for threat, process for threat, what's unsafe here, what do I need to be aware of, what do I need to be afraid of? And those perceptions can become my reality, even in, unfortunately, an early childhood space and place that's there ultimately to what? Help me and my family thrive. But it depending on those interactions with other human beings, because remember, human beings can be what? The best thing for my nervous system and the worst thing for our nervous system. So the more that we understand that families are always consistently and ongoing monitoring the external environment for threat, it's up here in their brains, that state-dependent functioning, right? And that all of our brains respond to those internal and external inputs around state-dependent functioning. So we know that kind of the capacity of any parent or family at any moment in any circumstance or any situation, it's actually fluid. It's moving and it's changing across domains: emotional, social, physical, regulatory, and our cognitive capacities. They shift with our internal states. I'll give you an example. If I am activated negatively and I'm around other people and people are asking me things, I know that I begin to shut down that fluidity as it's moving and changing. People are asking me things about dates and I'm saying, oh, that sounds great. And because I'm not in my head, yes, I've had this happen to me. They take it as a yes. And I don't remember ever saying yes or remember the date they gave me. So when I would supervise staff, and this was always happened, I would be walking down the hall and someone would catch me in the hall. And I would say, this sounds great. And they all knew what was going to happen. I'm not writing this down, so it probably won't happen. And that was really me being in tune to, as I was fluid and moving and changing and my regulatory state was changing, I had to say, when I experience this state, what can I give myself and those around me? And that was my response, that my cognitive capacities were shifting based on my internal state or that stress. So I had to come up with, what can I pull to give other people? And they got so used to hearing it that they used to laugh and say, if he's walking down the hall and he's moving fast, just don't say nothing to him. Wait until he's in his office sitting down. But the reality of that was they all picked up on it and waited until I was in a more regulated state to receive what it was they wanted to share. So here we see it, like this image of an adult and this image of a child. So as moment to moment, this changes for the parent or family across circumstances, the situations, this notion of fluidity, movement, and change. If it moves in one direction, some abilities are mobilized and others are enhanced. Some abilities close down and others decrease or increase. So when we think of state-dependent functioning, think of, wow, the experiences that I'm having with parents, and families, the experience that I'm having with other adults, we're having this connection, and definitely the experience that I'm having with young children. So I'll give it to you in this way. So you all know that I'm teaching a little bit this year in my middle age. And I've had a few assistants across the months come in and out. But one of the things that I kept trying to model was the importance of, as adults, us being aware of our emotional states, and that our emotional, if I show up in the morning decompensating at 8:30, the other adults around me and the children experience that. But if I show up in the morning regulated, anchored, and ready to go and prepared in ways that help me thrive, they all experience that also. So state-dependent functioning that I was trying to get them to understand with some of the children who at nap time will all be calling my name. And I'm thinking, it's hard for me to be with all of them at one time. And I wasn't patting backs. I wasn't rubbing backs. I was simply sitting beside children. Because what they connected to was my calm, right? Now, if I was sitting beside them thinking, I really want to go and have lunch, I really want to just sit in my car and listen to music, I want to walk around the block, they feel that. They feel that. They feel that. So this notion of that arousal staircase, children are in tune to in ways that I sometimes tell myself more effectively than adults. So let's spend some time now kind of experiencing this arousal staircase through this state-dependent functioning window. So we see here again, the blue arrow is coming down that arousal continuum and connecting to calm. The purple arrow is moving up and connecting to terror. So we see at the bottom, we have calm, alert, alarm, fear, and terror, right? And while this is in the book, we borrow all of this from Dr. Bruce Perry. Okay, so if anyone follows Dr. Bruce Perry and you want to go deeper, this is all coming from Dr. Bruce Perry. Hey, Michelle Tyler, I didn't know she was here. Hey, girl. I hope you're doing well. So, sorry about that. I get easily distracted sometimes.
The same. Hi.
All right. So given that a different part of our brain is in charge in these various states, and we call this staircase, we need to be mindful, right, of where the family might be within this arousal continuum at any given time. This has many implications, right, for how we provide support, or for supporting stress and implementing what we call, a trauma-informed or trauma-responsive practices within our role and responsibility program or school, community-based agency. So this activation for families of a stress response could include things like novelty. These are events or experiences that are unfamiliar. Parents perceive them as dangerous. Yep, novelty, newness. We have to have skill building to do that. So I provide PD for a living, one aspect of across the country, right? When I go to PDs myself that are in person, if I don't provide myself with self-talk before, I walk into the room, I sit at the back table by myself, I put my head down, and I open up my cell phone. So I'm telling the rest of the world what I'm shutting down, because they don't know that at my core, I'm still a shy 4-year-old. Because remember, our temperament stays the same throughout our life, but our personality can shift. Most people think they're the same and they're actually different. But when I speak to that shy 4-year-old and pull out the tools and say, Shawn, walk to the front, smile, sit at the front table, and don't pull your cell phone out. Every single time, two things happen to me. The person who's facilitating, who doesn't know me, calls me into the presentation. And if they have a gift to give, which is usually a book, I get a copy of the book for free every single time. So the message to myself should really say, Shawn, sit in the front. But if I'm not resourced well, and if my arousal continuum is a little bit higher, I forget and I run to the back because it feels safe in that unfamiliar space. This notion of unpredictability, right? Levels of uncertainty for families and parents that you're working with, or a constant sense of change. In early childhood, because we're contending with many of our younger folk don't want to do the work. They don't have, sustainability. They do it for a while and they quit. Many parents can be pushed into a different state of unpredictability for them and their child. If every time they come, there's a new adult there. There's a new adult there. And then here we're talking about parents and families having no personal agency or control, or no feeling of agency or control. So we're going to start at the bottom of this arousal continuum and go through these 5 before moving on to the principles. So if we think of this calm state on this arousal continuum, families feel here safe and comfortable, right? The top part of the brain is working well. They're keeping their feelings and they're regulated. Here, families can think in a more abstract term. They're open and they're curious. They can even delve into reflecting on things, right? So here, when families are calm, they actually are in a place to consider the past, the present, and the future, right? When they're connected to calm, they can even consider the past, the present, and the future. Here they can plan ahead for themselves and their family. And we see that they're thinking rationally about things like cause and effect, or the different behaviors, their behavior on their family, their partner, or their children. Now, while all interactions with families inherently can involve activating a stress response, here we are exposing families to something new after all this learning that they can later retrieve through memory. This is why it's important to do the work when they're connected to calm. This is why, like Kim talked about that group that she's hosting for mothers. So one of the things we used to do when I would do a father's group is when they would come in, we would talk about, how are you feeling? So many people skip over those because it seems like, oh, this is so basic and unnecessary. Let me just let them talk. But if there are 10 people there and all 10 of them checking around how they're feeling and why, I get to know, oh, they're all at calm, or I have a few at alert. I may have one in a state of terror or in fear. That tells me that what we're about to do, they will not be able to hold on to. Their participation is going to be different. But if the bulk of my group showed up at alarm, fear, and terror, I might have to do away with my script to anchor them differently. This is where those pieces are so important, so that we know as we're working with them how they're showing up, right? We know that it's okay to appear temporarily disengaged or distracted, or even fidgety. Because sometimes there's a frequent shift between that state of calm and alert states as new information is coming in. And families feel mixed around, are you going to ask me something too difficult that I may not be able to answer based on my existing information, right? So ideally, as we're working with families in this calm state, if we're holding on to being trauma responsive and state dependent functioning, you should be seeking what I call that arousal sweet spot for family engagement, that sweet spot for arousal around family engagement. This is when we sufficiently engage, motivate, and challenge. I'm going to say that again. Engage, motivate, and challenge. And families and parents don't feel a sense of overwhelm That's the most important piece here, that they don't walk away with a sense of overwhelm. At the alert state, here we find families are thinking in more concrete and even less creative terms about their interactions with each other as parents, or even with their child or children, or definitely with us, regardless of our supportive role. Here, when families are less able to engage in reflection, of course, because they're not at that calm state, our role is to maintain this level of interest in how they're reacting to the information and the input. We know that at the alert stage, a family's sense of time becomes a little bit more narrower around how they consider hours and days ahead. And it definitely continues to shorten as they move up that arousal continuum. So I'd like to share as a caveat, some families, now there's some people who say it's just culture around people who show up late. So if you say your appointment is at 10 o'clock, and some people say, well, they got there at 10:15, they were late. And other people, they're saying they're on time. Then there are other people who say 9:45 or 9:50 would have been on time. Through this lens, though, a family whose state-dependent functioning is moving up that arousal continuum, even though they knew 2 weeks ahead that appointment was on Tuesday at 10 a.m., depending on where they are, their sense of time can shut down from the night to the morning, and they end up there, but they don't end up at the appointed time. These are those ways that we become trauma responsive and don't go to, oh, they're just lazy. They didn't care about the time. They can't keep appointments. That's a whole nother way to see it, where we miss all of this right here with and for families. At this alert state, we have to consider a family with a history of adverse experiences. They're going to have a much greater sensitivity to stress than other families, right? The alarm state could be, in fact, their default for some families. And they'll end up leaping up into the fear state more quickly if we're not paying attention. We find that what helps families at the alert state is increased structure and this notion of how do we differentiate, right? It will help them to mitigate their anxiety about new tasks and less familiar routines. And that new task could be how our program or school is asking them to participate in those less familiar routines, which could be brand new to them. I'm gonna tell you how we did this in general across the globe. At the beginning of the pandemic, preschools, Head Start, early learning programs start telling parents, you need to create schedules and routines for your children. What we were really saying was do exactly what we do in our programs. So these were new tasks and they were unfamiliar to them. And all we did was create more stress for parents and families who then felt like they were ineffective as a parent and a family. We did that in early childhood. And every opportunity, I was calling it out and saying, this notion of learning loss, because I'm with my mother, or I'm my abuelita, my nana, my tia, we've got to rethink this, because the research that came out in 2021 said that actually children gain unconstrained learning by being with their grandmothers and being with their families. Where at school, we teach constrained learning, but we kept saying learning loss. They were learning in a different way. And fundamentally, children who needed more time for social emotional growth receive that. They may not have given me my alphabet and my letters and my numbers, but there was more time to lower my stress response because I was with my grandma. Yep. This is from someone who didn't go to kindergarten and preschool, who spent his time at his maternal grandmother's house, largely playing in her garden, making mud pies. And I ended up not having an IEP or any, learning challenges when I did enter that compulsory education school door. So when families are here at the alert state, we find that giving them repetitive opportunities to practice new concepts and skills can be helpful. Meaning going back to recreated structure so they get to do the same thing every single day, the same thing every single day. And it could be something as routine as signing their child into your program and the sign-in book stays in the same place and they know what to do. But then if you're constantly trying to figure out the best place for the sign-in and it keeps moving, I guarantee you, you're going to find some of those parents going to stop signing in. They're not going to ask where it is, or they may even sign in on the wrong page. This is when parents and families are living in that alert state, right? They're living in that alert state. So the one thing that we find also that can be really helpful for parents and families as they're moving up that arousal continuum, and we recognize they're at the alert state, is to talk to them about bringing downtime into their lives, in bringing themselves periods of revisiting and reflecting on prior conversations when they're calm can be really, really helpful for parents and at the alert state to come down to the calm state, the calm states. So if you're paying really good attention, when parents are at the alarm state, you'll notice that their breathing and their heart rates tend to get faster. Their muscles become tense. They're not able to now process information with efficiency. And you're going to notice that they find it harder to focus on what you're trying to present. You may even notice a change in how they speak and move. This is why oftentimes that if they're in the room with me and there's a desk, I always want a sofa or 2 chairs to be there, and I don't sit behind the desk. I try my best 95% of the time to sit by them so that I can watch all of those pieces because it's information for me, right? So noticing how they change their speech and how they're speaking and how they're moving, it becomes harder for them when you see those things to think rationally. They may start to talk about the past, but the present is just what? Hours and minutes for them. They become more sensitive to how we look at them, our tone of voice, and our posture. I was actually talking to a parent about 2 weeks ago, and we were at the door to the classroom, and she started to get activated. And, you know, those old synapses that live in my brain, her voice went up, and then my voice went up. But I recognized my voice went up. And when my voice went up, I grabbed her hand and I made her smile. And I started to smile. And I was like, that's not what I want to do with you. That's not what I want to do. And I said, I am sorry my voice just went up. And guess what happened? She started nodding her head and she said, me neither. But imagine had I not been aware that she was moving up that arousal and I followed her, we could have ended up in a very negative place, literally standing in that preschool classroom. But that awareness and what I did helped me connect to my calm and offer her the space to come back down, right? To come back down. Because she was sensitive to what was happening, right? We find that when parents are here at the alarm state, a punitive approach is useless. So you all know I love talking about the parent in Oakland who, when she came and talked about her daughter, had I said, if you don't calm down, we're going to call the cops, or you need to leave, you didn't have a scheduled appointment, pardon me, all of those would have been punitive responses that would have continued to lower her level of functioning, and it would have pushed her further up that arousal continuum. So Dr. Perry says, think of his 3 R's of regulate, relate, and reason. Regulate, relate, and reason. They offer a more appropriate sequence of engagement when parents have moved that far up the arousal continuum. He also says, start with their senses, regulating their body and brain through movement. And if you go to last week's, there's a slide, an orange slide, where I talk about coping mechanisms and coping strategies, and that movement, dance, art, breathing, and grounding are all coping strategies. Notice cell phone use isn't there. as a coping mechanism, right? As a coping mechanism. They also find that the more we can increase our frequency of offering nurturing and empathetic interactions with parents and families, if we find that they're up their arousal continuum on at the alarm state, we've got to connect them to our compassion. And I'm finding that in 2024, conveying our compassion has become harder and more difficult for far too many people. So we've got to do some introspection around how do we show up being the most compassionate human being that we can for parents and families as they're moving up that arousal continuum. I'll leave you with this. I think it's in the slide from last week, Leah and Catherine. I think when parents and families are at the alarm state, we have to be therapeutic without being their therapist. I think this demands that we become therapeutic without being their therapists in terms of our interactions when parents and families are at an alarm state. And I do think it's in the slide from last week. It's a adult and a child. And I was talking about that parallel process, that one need not be a therapist to be therapeutic, is what I believe the slide says. So as we get to the top of that arousal continuum, here, parents and families at the fear arousal, they're reactive. They're only reacting to their surroundings. And here, you're going to see them being more prone to fight, flight, and freeze when they're at the fear state. Because at the fear state, our sense of time is restricted to the next, few minutes or even seconds. Their feeling is overwhelmed. It's overwhelmed. And I found this out the hard way. When parents and families are at the fear state, they're not going to easily trust your suggestions, even if they supposedly trust you. Because what's being constricted, they're not understanding the ramifications. They're not understanding the ramifications. They may actually refuse to do what you say and look for a chance to escape what you're expecting them to do. Here, they really need us to simply accept how they feel and to show that we understand. To accept how they feel and to show that we understand. And I offer the other part. Demonstrating your understanding does not mean you accept the behavior. So many of us say, if I let them do that, they're going to think that behavior is okay. Not through a trauma lens, not through a trauma-responsive family engagement lens. That's not what we're asking for here. We're asking us as professionals to pivot and shift and to not say, I do it this way for everybody. Yikes. It's about shifting and saying, this parent and family is right here at this time, and they need me to show up and do things a little bit differently around how I am responding and not reacting. Here, their behavior will seem irrational. But think about what seems irrational to you is them attempting to survive that moment. Think about it in that way, right? So at the top of this arousal continuum is terror. Here, the bottom of our brains are completely in charge. That means the oldest part of the brain, the most primitive part of the brain, there's no sense of time. Sometimes there's no sense of where they are or what they're doing. They're not thinking anymore. We're seeing these parents and families' reflexes. Their instinctive desire to control or retreat has taken over. It's taken over. Here's what you can notice. Oftentimes they get very still. They could be rocking back and forth. If you come too close, they might lash out or run away. Our mindset should be on safety. On safety. It's going to take time for that terror state to subside. We find that in order for us to become a source of safety in that moment, comfort and reassurance is what we need to present in terms of keeping track of our own brain states. I'll say that again. For parents and families that are moving in that terror state, in order for us to be a source of safety, comfort and reassurance is what we need to keep track of for our own brain states. We often hear people here say, oh, those references to self-care and looking after yourself. You know, these messages simply can't be overstated, of course, that self-care is important, or putting your own oxygen mask on first, even when your instinct is to what? Grab it and put it on your child or children. As supports to parents and families who are living with, through, and around different levels of trauma, this is why it's important for us to indulge and engage in activities that help us feel and connect the calm early and often, right? So that we can then connect to it to be supportive to other families. If we don't do that for ourselves, it makes it difficult for us to help them when they're in that state if we can't regulate our own emotions because we haven't practiced it in those situations or circumstances. One of the things that I often tell, because I coach also, and when I'm leading coaches, and sometimes coaches say, oh, that was an awful coaching session. And then I say, oh, it sounds like it was, but some of those are the best coaching sessions. And they always say, what do you mean? I say, because it's prepped me and my brain in terms of my response. I receive real practice because that will happen again. So when it happens again, I have something else to pull from, right? Because my brain and my body has said, oh, this is familiar. We've been through this already. So if we respond and not react to parents and families at the terror state, we're helping ourselves to be able to respond again. Sometimes in our jobs, maybe it was only the places where I work, but some of you may have worked at places where things are happening within the agency or the school, and people will say, go get Denise, go get Denise, go get Denise. Like, and then Denise comes running. What they're really saying is she handles this well. And what I've come to believe is when parents and families are at that fear or terror state and we say, go get Denise, Denise is the one who's pretty much the most connected to calm. She's not making it about her. She's able to show up and what? Help that parent in terms of reassurance and comfort. That's really what Go Get Denise, I find, is oftentimes about, right? So this is the time when you need to think about your own plan for stress management, right? What activities help you to relax, that you find rewarding? What activities help you to connect with people in an understanding and supportive way, right? In an understanding and supportive way. That's the resource in that you need, or I should say we need, to help parents and families when they're in the terror state, when they're in the terror state. And I'll end with this before I move to the next slide. The terror state won't always look and sound the same. I have a 5-year-old whose parents are divorced. He's with dad one week, he's with mom the next week. He's with dad one week and mom the next week. And I have a really great relationship with both. But when I realized that there was still like this churning between the parents, and that I have been set up by one parent against the other, and I'm thinking I'm just having great conversations during pickup, and one parent called the other parent in a state of terror, but because of relationship, the other parent literally called me. And I was thinking, I just had the conversation 10 minutes ago. And, you know, the next day I kind of said, oh, hey, that other person gave me a call when you left. The person was kind of caught off guard. But what I was doing was saying, in my own way, you all have this terror interaction always that you pulled me into the tornado. I found a way out of the tornado. I'm going to be supportive, but I won't engage in the tornado without ever using those words. My behavior was one of comfort and reassurance, and being direct about what had been said to the other person that wasn't a part of our conversation, but I was being used in this awful, awful way. Some people may say, Shawn, that sounds like alarm. Well, trauma is individualized. What happens for one person doesn't mean it's going to happen for the other person that way, which is another experience. You can have the same experience happen to two sets of families, and their responses are not the same at all. Oftentimes, what I find in early learning settings is we'll start saying, that family's just putting 20 on 10. They're doing too much. It wasn't that deep. We begin to ignore what they're saying was an awful experience because the other family had more resourcing, or what we call resilience. We're going to get to that in a moment. The arousal continuum, the arousal continuum. The last part about the terror is the struggle to keep in mind that unfortunately, too many of us as adults, parents and families, the demands of our ever-changing and hectic world can push us up the arousal continuum without us ever recognizing it. Without us ever recognizing it. So I love this quote. I love this quote. Stress is contagious, so is calmness. Stress is contagious, so is calmness. This is about mirror neurons that aid us in our abilities, right? To understand what another person is feeling or experiencing. Our mirror neurons in our brains, they're activated. They're activated when we witness someone else taking action, right? These are things like people moving towards us, gesturing for assistance, noticing someone's experiencing an emotion. I know when I'm with toddlers, I do that. It's like one of the things that I do often with toddlers is help them notice the emotions of others around them as a way to build on that. Or when people are gesturing for assistance, naming what's happening for young children, but also naming that for adults can be really, really important when we think of their traumas, particularly being activated or triggered or jolted. Bringing language to it around that mirror neuron can really help them to settle in the moment, to calmness. The same way, adults who walk into spaces and they're functioning at a 9 on the scale of 1 to 10, in terms of I'm doing this as if it were my hand is going up and down, as if it were a jumping machine. And then what you'll find is the people around them start to do that. Or you ever walk into a space and it's calm, and then 1 or 2 people come in and they're navigating that a 9 or a 10, and then all of a sudden the space becomes loud and almost unmanageable. That's what this is right here. Everybody else is not paying attention to that internal stress that the other person is carrying and may not have named. And then the environment becomes that. But the same way it can affect stress in that way at a negative space, calmness can affect us in a positive way as we're supporting parents and families, as teachers are supporting young children and their parents and families. We just have to be conscious of it and know what is happening. Kristen says, can you share one of your most traumatic moments with the family and the kids? What happened, your approach with the family? So I would say the most traumatic was a father and his son were both murdered in a Head Start program in Oakland years ago. I would say that was probably the most traumatic I had ever experienced, like vicariously. It didn't happen directly to me, but it was around us, I'm not sure that makes for the best story, Kristen, but in terms of going back, that probably was the most, but we resourced, we got together and we talked to the children. about death. And when I look back, they were probably the most encouraging piece that helped me to move forward, because as we started explaining it, they started sharing their understandings of death at 3, 4, and 5. And I realized in the moment, that they actually experienced death in different ways that we hadn't given them credit for. Like they were saying 3 and 4 responses, like, oh, the bug died. Oh, the so-and-so when my mom's driving on the highway, dead bugs are on the car windshield. But to them, see how they were making a developmentally appropriate connection with death. So we were thinking, how are we going to present it to them that this child is never coming back? What they showed up and said was, we have some understanding of this, make it age appropriate. So it really was the adults saying, we have to deal with our grief in a different way. In those who don't feel like they're strong enough, why does, I think it is okay at times for adults to cry around children. We need to be mindful that, and I'm going back to this experience, Kristen, I was pushing that I didn't want the children to end up holding what the adults were holding. And that was a teeter-totter around folk who couldn't do it. I didn't want them in the room. Because the children wanted to pay attention to that and think they needed to take care of us. But they showed us we have capacities to this horrible experience that their Head Start child, their friend, was never coming back. But that was probably the most, for me, traumatic one. And as I was a mental health consultant at the time, and kind of what we did and the response and then offering services and supports that look different for different families. I had some families that wanted to tell children, oh, I'm changing the name, Kirsten. Little Tommy's, in heaven with Jesus, and as someone who was raised in the church and believes in a higher being, that is not what we're telling him. And I was that Black consultant that pushed back against that Black family around, it can be a both and, but you're confusing him by simply telling them that. And then I shared some of the antidotes around what we were hearing at school. So it wasn't like we had this conversation and it went away. What began to unearth was the families and how they all felt different about death and what they believe. So how did we respect their beliefs and their practices, but at the same time arm children with this other piece? So it was interesting, and I take nothing else for the journey, Kirsten. Vanessa said they are capable so much more than we give them credit. Mm-hmm. Definitely. So here we have this notion of being trauma responsive, this attuned. So I like Dan Siegel's 4 S's when I think of a tuning, that young children and parents and families need to be seen, right? But they should be safe. Let me give it in the way he gives it. Safe. They should experience safety. So we should be creating conditions and context for safety. Then they should feel seen in a way. So regardless of where I am on that arousal continuum, you should see me and validate, even if you don't accept how I am showing up in this way, that I feel soothed. Soothe is really this notion. People's like, oh, I got to rub their backs. That's what one woman said to me. I said, if it's appropriate, it could work for a particular family, but that's not what we're saying here. This soothing is this notion, I like to use flow, that from those other 2 experiences, the family now feels what? This flow of, I'm coming down the arousal continuum. So that flow is, imagine just flowing down that arousal continuum from the top back to the bottom. We need the first 3 S's of feeling safe, seen, and soothed for the 4th to exist. The 4th does not exist without the other 3. And the 4th one is what? Security, anchored, connected to you. This is why this attunement is really important as a trauma responsive way to be, right? Regardless if it's top down or bottom regulation, it's the intentional recognition of disconnection that we're working against so that we can move towards connection, right? And I say that to say that what the research keeps confirming is that relational regulation is one of the most powerful ways to buffer stress. I'll say that again. Regulation is a powerful way to buffer stress. And sometimes it happens unknowingly, right? But we want to be intentional about it as supports for parents and families and their young children. And we do that in this respectful and caring way, because that's how they experience safety in our presence. So our question for reflection here is, how do we demonstrate respect and care? How do we demonstrate respect and care? I like to say by being dependable, by being someone they can trust, right? By listening, believing in them, being warm and encouraging them. So here we talk about our job. Our job is to make the environment. If it's your clinic, if it's your, your office space where you see them for treatment or therapy, if it's your classroom, if it's your community-based agency, if it's a parent and family play group, wherever you're seeing them, part of our job is to make that environment safer and more regulated for them so they can make better decisions at the bottom of that arousal continuum instead of at the top of that arousal continuum. So Dr. Bruce Perry says, all decision making is state dependent. And that if we want somebody to be regulated and you want them to have full access to their prefrontal or their cortex when they make the decisions, right? That quote is what is necessary. That quote is what is necessary, because all decision-making is state dependent, according to Dr. Bruce Perry, within our policies and practices, organizations, right? Or your leadership style. Is your leadership style one that's regulated, or is it one that unfortunately dysregulated and toxic? Unfortunately. So some actions we can take. So we find that building in what we call short regulation breaks as much as possible can be helpful for families. When working with families, the more stressed they are or their early childhood providers are, they need to experience this early and often. Short intentional regulation breaks. Short intentional regulation breaks. This is about us being patient and engaging with families during difficult conversations without becoming reactive. I often tell people, I believe in this so much because I think back to being, 23, 24, and 25, and how I know some of my responses were reactive. And now being older, I look back and I giggle at myself because my responses are so different now around being able to demonstrate patience, in time, how I engage with parents and families around difficult conversations, where the goal is not to be reactive, but to actually demonstrate co-regulation with parents and families when they're dysregulated as part and parcel of my role, And some of you have heard me say this, like sometimes people say, let's stand up and do a body stretch real quick. Would you breathe with me? Or, I know I have some colleagues who actually intentionally always have a variety of warm teas when they're meeting with parents, and they offer them, Kim saying me, offering them the warm cup of tea to drink, or something as simple as when they come in to the building, the adult washing their hands, or listening for 60 seconds to music, or saying an important quote. That all of these are short regulation breaks that can pull them from that other place if they show up that arousal continuum and pull them back down. One of the things that I am sharing with everybody is when you have the opportunity, and in California, I think the opportunity presents more than other places to actually walk and talk with them. Spend the whole 30 minutes or 45 minutes just walking and talking. For a variety of reasons, it's a strategy. And as our bodies are contending with whatever trauma is taken in, our body processes it differently when we're moving opposed to sitting still. So anybody that has that ability, particularly if you have to have a difficult conversation, and if you can walk and talk, you're going to get so much positive feedback from it. And this is from personal experience of this notion of moving and walking and talking throughout the conversation. Yeah, just make sure you set an alarm so that you get back on time, because if you spend the whole time walking one way, then you're going to have to spend that time coming back the other way, and they may end up getting more time than they were supposed to with you. I made that mistake twice. So it's effective, but keep a timer. So when you notice that your parents and families are activated up the arousal continuum, and Kim put in having fidget toys, definitely up the arousal, we want to decrease the number of times that we ask them to make decisions, right? I'm not going to ask a very stressed parent to make many decisions. Many times I know I have 3 things I want to ask them, but I'll say, don't worry, we'll get to it later, or we can do it next week. And I'm intentional about that, because I'm recognizing that, they're stressed and they're activated, and giving them more will only push them further up that arousal continuum, As much as possible, when you recognize a parent is stressed, reduce what you're asking them to do. So a parent that comes in to register their child and they want to enroll, instead of forcing them to sit there and do it if they're upset, I'm going to say, well, here's the process. You can take this part, or you can fill this part out, and you can bring this part back. I'm trying to shorten what I'm asking them to do as much as possible, because I paid attention that they showed up in a very, very stressed way. And oftentimes they show up stressed because they're saying, my life is changing. I don't have care for my child, so this is causing additional stress. So that's when I oftentimes lean in and say, once we get all of this back, your child can start. And I try to give them a date. Your child will be able to start on this date. Or once we get this back, your child's appointment can happen here. Because it's giving them clarity of, here's my window, even though I'm stressed. And it reduces what we're asking them to do as much as possible. I struggled with this one in the beginning because stress reduces people's capacity. We find that the more stressed adults, parents, families, teachers, providers are managing, the greater the need to create opportunities for people to work in partnership with others. I struggled with this until I read Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmom's Hands. So Resmaa was one of the first people who, and he's a therapist, that really helped me see the benefit of both, and the notion of, in terms of healing, doing things individually and then doing things communally, and that it wasn't one, but this notion of both and. I do some things to heal myself individually, and then I find a group to do some healing with. I do some things to heal myself with individually, and then I find a group, and it's vacillating back and forth that I resisted. I'm transparent about, I'm always in the healing process as a living human being, and I'll be in one until I cease to exist in this form. But my resistance to partnering, I found was unfounded, that when I experienced it, things begin to change completely differently. And that's what we're getting at here, that you might be the partner for the family, or it could be someone else, but do they have that? And possibly, do they need more than one partner to accomplish and reduce their stress around whatever it is that they need to partner with. And then that last one, this notion of mind wandering. This isn't daydreaming. This could actually be just having parents and families think about their next goal, but out loud, and just think of the multiple ways that that could happen as an action, as a strategy before they make decisions. Because then other ideas that they didn't think of pops into mind, and it's not so time bound. It's not make the decision right now, letting your mind wander as an action. Another one that was hard for me around letting my mind wander, simply because I'm always activated by, I want to know the answer. And then when I'm in those moments, I have to remind myself, situate myself in the process, Shawn, not having an answer. But, as a trained educator, most people who have, that education background, educators are trained to have answers. So it's ironic that part of how we're training educators now is to embrace ambiguity. So the textbook says have the answer, but in practice, we're saying here's all this beauty of staying in the process of not having to know all the answers, but being able to guide oneself through a process to get to an answer, which is different. So we're going to end our short time together today with inside the text, inside the book, principles and practices for responsive family in engagement. In the book, these are the core principles of trauma responsive family practices. We call them the guiding principles that kind of provide a broad set of values and beliefs that guide early childhood professionals working with parents and families. In the text, we introduced readers of the text to 8 guiding principles that we recommend they use to guide their ongoing efforts, if you will, to build more trauma responsive, resilience building, and healing centered approaches to engaging with young children and their families. There we go. That's where we should be. Thank you, Leah. So the first principle and practice in the book that we call out is building mutually respectful and trusting relationships that lead to power sharing partnerships. Okay, so when you contribute to a text with multiple authors, sometimes things show up in the book and you're like, okay, it's there, I get it. So I'm taking a long way around because of this, and people may have heard me say this. I struggle with the word power as anything that I can agree upon with parents. And that's because my personal beliefs is that the outcomes of any type of power is ultimately negative and that someone doesn't benefit. So my own personal thing is that I struggle with the word power sharing, even though it's in the text. So I just want to call that out, and we spell out the meaning and the intent here. But I just think anytime we're attempting to share power, we're creating context for someone else to have power over someone else, even if it's a parent, or if it's parent to me, and then we set up conditions for that power to grow and grow and grow and grow. But here, what we mean is when parents and families have what we call relational support, they can develop important coping skills and even resiliencies. So we find that parents and families who thrive in the context of consistent, nurturing, and responsive relationships, that they partner with us, right? That's the essence of building mutually respectful and trusting relationships. Here we find that, safety is reinforced when relationships are based in respect, reciprocity, and responsiveness. When we think of respect, differences do not make people wrong. I'll say that again. Differences do not make people wrong. Reciprocity, this notion of diversity is seen as always life enhancing, not something that's in the way, but it's always life enhancing for all of us. And that responsiveness, there's always a third choice, or a fourth choice or a fifth choice. There's always one we didn't think about or consider. And in the text, we kind of unpack this notion of emergent listening with families, always listening to what's not being said or presented as a core principle. The second one is understand stress and trauma, that it does affect children and can affect children and families, communities and organizations, and that we can help them to refrain otherwise confusing and frustrating behaviors on the part of the adult or the child or children. Thank you, Leah. Acknowledging systems of privilege and oppression and how they can take action to disrupt inequities. This is really about not avoiding re-traumatizing and disrupting policies, practices, or conditions that harm the children and families. I'm gonna leave that one there, Catherine. And then the next one is about increasing our awareness about oppression, right? Like understanding what is oppression. We defined it inside the text. We define it inside the text, and building a shared vocabulary is really one of the ways to talk about oppression and privilege, even in the context of early childhood and family engagement. And how do we disrupt that and create and aim towards a trauma responsive, healing centered approach? And this notion of healing centered, one of the handouts that even though I typically don't train on Dr. Shawn Jim Wright stuff, I've offered you all the healing centered. He has a book, but there's also an article that is in the handouts around Dr. Jim Wright's healing centered approach that is inside the text. And then this next one, as a principle, what's missing? What is missing? Think about what is significantly missing in language and frameworks that address parent and family engagement or involvement. And how do we have an honest reckoning that early child professionals cannot hope to build trust with families who have been or continue to be silenced, marginalized, positioned through deficit and harm by institutions and systems that propose to support them, right? This is in housing, childcare, healthcare. So what is missing? What is missing? And how do we continue with it? So Laura, who's one of the contributing authors, says, if we're not willing to be changed or impacted ourselves, then we're not doing trauma responsive work. And I added her quote because I felt like it was really, really important. And this is really important if we think of racial trauma, is too often not acknowledged or discussed in ways that are meaningful and necessary for parents and families, right? Before we can build trust, we must acknowledge histories and sources of distrust. I'm building up to our final few slides here, Leah and Catherine. How do we, as early childhood professionals, begin the process of addressing distrust with parents and families? So I'm gonna pull from Brother Resma Meniken's work, where he talks about the impact of trauma decontextualized, the impact of trauma decontextualized. Here we go. It wasn't moving at first, Leah. So what you're about to watch now is Resma Meniken, who's the author of My Grandmother's Hands and another book on relationships called Monsters in Love that I actually like a lot. He's doing an interview in Good Day LA, but just listen to him talking about trauma decontextualized, and we're gonna, end with end with this in our last 15 minutes together. The video is not 15 minutes, but then the next few slides, we're going to end strong that way. All right.
For more than 20 years, trauma therapist Resma Manakin has been doing work around racial equality and the traumatic impact of racism in the United States. The need for us to recognize this trauma, metabolize it, work through it, and grow from it. Resma examines the damage caused by racism from the perspective of trauma and body-centered psychology. I recently caught up with him virtually. I read you said the words, I'm a cultural trauma navigator. What does that mean?
Well, first off, I really try and acknowledge the fact that we live, especially if you're in a black body or you're in a brown body, we live in a society, in a culture that can be traumatizing to us and has been traumatizing to us and our people. And so I really take that seriously. I don't like throw that away. I believe that, when you live in a structure that's predicated on the white body being the standard of humanness, then every other body is a deviance from that standard. And that is traumatizing off top before anything else is done. And so that's what I mean, helping people to navigate that, helping people understand that they're not defective intrinsically or innately, that structurally we have not been considered human.
I have been so fascinated with the fact that we are finally beginning to have conversations about the effect of trauma on us, right? We are starting that conversation as a world, as a nation, as a people. Now, you're even taking it a step further about looking at what that trauma, because we've learned to understand that trauma stays in the body in a way it doesn't stay in the brain, right?
That's right. That's right. The body, see, people, a lot of treatment over the years in order to deal, that people have developed in order to deal with trauma has been focused on cognition. Okay. And cognition can't touch the body when it's trying to protect itself, right? And trauma, one of the things I always say to people is that trauma over time can be decontextualized. The march of time decontextualizes trauma. Okay. So trauma in a person over time can look like personality. Trauma in a family over time can look like family traits.
Oh my.
Trauma in a people over time can look like culture. And so beginning to help people navigate that and work with that, work with the notions, sis, like being a black person in any type of environment, especially a corporate environment or especially an environment which we work in, you have to navigate and pick up on vibrations and notions and notions of things.
Nuances.
And sometimes we think we're crazy. Sometimes we think, man, I'm picking up on something, but I don't quite have the word for it. And sometimes that notion is a pass-through from other generations. It is the thing that got passed down that never got worked through. And by the time it gets to you, there's no context for it. So it just works in the body.
Ooh, brother, you're blowing people's minds right now. There are going to be people that I'm sure you have come across this before where people are like, now he's just talking crazy. How do you respond to them? How do you get them to understand that this is real and it is so urgent in our communities?
What I tell people to do is you don't have to believe me, believe your body. Just slow down. Just slow down. Just stop. Just pause. Listen to what I'm saying and don't do nothing with it. Just pause and listen to what your body tells you. Is there a constriction? Is there a movement? Is there a snarl? Is there a hum? Is there a rock? Is there something that wants to move? Is there an urge? Is there a vibration? Is there a temperature change? Just notice that. You ain't got to believe me. Just become accustomed to slowing and conditioning and tempering your body so you can take in both the things that show up that's constrictive and the joy.
Wow. The fact that you start there, it's a door opening, because then you now can have a conversation with people who might not be willing to meet you on the work that you're doing. there is a way to heal trauma in the body, correct? Or are we destined to only understand it and not heal it?
Never. Never that. Our people survived some of the most heinous brutality and viciousness. And if you say that there was no healing in that process, I would push back against you. The fact of the matter is that trauma can be healed, but we have only developed individual approaches to a communal horror. What has happened to a lot of our people didn't happen to us individually, it happened communally. So to only develop individual responses to a communal horror and a communal brutality is inadequate. And part of what I've been trying to help people do is to begin to develop with other bodies a culture, what I call a living embodied anti-racist culture and practices. So those things that could emerge as healings have a place to sprout up from, rather than just trying to give people tips or strategies.
Are people listening?
Some are, right? And some are just performing.
Interesting. I get that. I see the difference.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, Resmaa, you and I have communicated on social media. I've been watching your work for some time, interested in this area of trauma and the effect it has on Black and brown bodies and Indigenous bodies. And I was struggling to figure out how we could have the conversation, because it's like eating an elephant. But you kind of counseled me that it is like eating an elephant one bite at a time. This is a great starting point for people. If they want more information, they can follow you on social media. You're very vocal there. On Instagram, your videos you people can hear straight from you. And also they can pick up your book, My Grandmother's Hands, a New York Times bestseller. I cannot thank you enough for making time for me today. Minneapolis, you stay strong, brother. Thank you so much for being with us.
I appreciate you so much, sis. Thank you.
Take care and stay safe. Resmaa said, if you don't believe me, believe your body. Ooh, special stuff.
All right. Thank you all for listening. And I'm trying to be conscious of the time, so I'm paying attention in the way that I can be sometimes guilty of not paying attention. So a big takeaway that I want you all to get as we relate to how we engage with families, right? Or how we even involve families, if that's where you and your program are along that continuum. So when we think of, I'm just going to call them out so I can talk, and sometimes I forget to press. There we go. This is a little bit easier. So what Resmaa is talking about is that trauma in the family decontextualized over time. We begin to say, well, you know, that's just how those Jacksons are. That Jackson family, I've had 3 generations of them at this school in this program. That's just how they are. And he says, that's actually not how they are. That's their trauma showing up, right? And then until that gets unpacked, we misunderstand it. He says that trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like personality. We all have experienced that person. You get to the school or the clinic and they're at the front desk. You know, Miss Mamie's been there for 40 years and she's saying, yeah, what you want? Fill that out. And you're like, what just happened to me? Like, why is she talking to me this way? And then everyone says, you know, that's just her personality. She's cantankerous. No, this is Miss Mamie's trauma that's unchallenged, unchecked, and unchanged. It is greeting everyone at the door, and that we've got to really put it in the right context. Then he says that trauma in a people decontextualized, we say that that is culture, and it is not culture. And my favorite, that trauma in a workplace decontextualized looks like workplace standards that are passed down. So I get hired and they say, Shawn, you know, your working hours are 9 to 4:30. But then Kim says, Shawn, you know, we all get here at 8:30, right? And, you know, we eat at our desk most days. We don't leave the building for lunch. This is trauma. Or this is, you know, I know that get off the work day ends at 4:30, but we all stay until everything is done. We never leave work unfinished. Imagine those of us who've experienced this, because some of you I can see are smiling. You've heard these types of things before. Entry to the job, that these are traumas that are passed down to new people, and then we pretend like they're workplace standards because some toxic leader created them and the juggernaut took off and it moves and moves and moves. So I want us to understand these pieces as we engage ourselves, those around us, but most importantly, young children in their families, There's so much to talk about here. I'm going to skip that question and I'm going to jump to this one as one of our closing slides, Catherine. A sign of a healthy relationship with the family is not one absent of conflicts. I'm gonna give you all time to read that. It's not one absent of conflict. That means anticipate that you may have contentious conversations, you may have difficult conversations with parents and families. Don't give up. Stay in the conversation. Don't think, oh, this is bad because we're not agreeing. Stay in the conversation. That conflict is part and parcel of it. Remember last week we talked about no one lives constantly in a regulated state, but those of us who understand when the dysregulation occurs can pull ourselves by pulling out of our toolbox. The same kind of mindset is offered here, okay? So the others, I'm going to, jump through quickly, and I want to get to this one slide. What do we mean by resilience? So I like this one simply because when we think of the 3 stress responses, that this notion of there's something called positive stress, tolerable stress, or toxic or severe stress. So we know at the right, when that purple line goes up and it stays up, for young children, we found that it usually stays up because those young children don't have at least one positive adult actively involved in their lives. And for us as adults, when it goes up, it's usually not having partners or supportive people. So we end up thinking we're in it by ourselves. And for young children, when that line goes up and it stays up, it could actually start to change their brain or put holes in their brain. In the middle, we see the purple line goes up. That's the stress response, cortisol. But then over time, it starts to come down. That's tolerable stress. These are things that happen a little while longer, like breaking a leg for a young child or a parent dies. They're stressed, but then they find a really great, play therapist and they get better, or a parent goes through a divorce. Their stress response goes up, but ultimately, most times it comes down. The one I want us to pay real attention to today is the one that's called positive. The one over here that's called positive. Okay, I'm thinking I'm moving the slide again. Here we go. All right, I'm sorry, everyone. The slide's supposed to animate, and I don't want to click it again because it might jump to another slide. The star is supposed to pulsate. I renamed positive stress as useful stress. So when we as human beings, children, adolescents, adults, see this one, the stress response goes up and it comes right back down. See, I knew that was going to happen, Catherine. I pressed the button and it moved the slide and I didn't want it to. Leah, can you get us back to the types of stress response slide? And there we go, our last 2 minutes. Whew, all right. This is useful because this is what builds resilience. So those parents and families that say, I don't want my child to ever cry. My child fell down yesterday at your preschool, and they grow up, and at 40, they're still living with their parents and haven't figured out because of what they don't get. They haven't built resiliency. And we're seeing this in research for children who were largely children that were born in the 80s who are now in their 40s. But that's a whole nother training and a whole nother day. But this useful stress is how we build resiliency. So the absence of it, and this notion that all children are resilient, I want us to do away with that because I'm still hearing that in some circles. It can be supported and built with right intention on the part of the adults. Children oftentimes don't do it alone or in isolation. The same is true for their families. That useful stress for their family is them building their capacities when they have limited interactions that cause them stress, and their stress point comes down immediately, which is how they're able to deal with when you say both families experience the same thing. This family is falling apart, and this family is like, yeah, that was difficult, but we're moving on. We often say that, well, trauma is an individualized situation. It's not the event, but what I've built up in terms of how I respond to the event. And we find that the more a parent and family has built resiliency, their response to it can be different. Okay? So we want to think about how are we helping parents not to just be resilient, but before I need to be resilient, what are the experiences that I need to have to build that, to buffer me, to buffer my children when that happens? We're at the top of the hour. So definitely thank you all for your time and attention. First Five always wants your feedback. They're going to be sending a survey soon. I appreciate you all staying and being with us during this learning journey. I hope that your thinking was activated, your thinking stems were activated, and that you caught some memories, you caught some feelings and thoughts, you caught pieces of discomfort. Many people feel discomfort when Resmaa starts talking because, you know, race is presented to the front and then people say, ooh, we can't talk about race, but I'm a good person. I'm joking with everybody. And then this notion of resiliency. So a lot was put out there. Our goal is that you won't just see it as today, but you see this as, for many of us, the beginning of another journey or the continuation and pieces that we can pull into your continued journey around being trauma responsive for our youngest children and their parents and families who care and educate them in different places and spaces. Thank you all. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, First Five Alameda. And thank you all for showing up again and again and again. And I'm praying that you all had something to chew on, to take away.
Thank you again, Shawn. We appreciate the opportunity that you provide us with this training to reflect on how we could best show up with our parents, adding to our toolbox by knowing how to respond or react on the arousal continuum, and also exploring different ways to connect to calm. So we truly appreciate it. It's more than one takeaway from today, but again, we thank you. And we thank you all for joining us today and continuing to engage in our conversation. So we hope to see you in the near future. And again, please fill out the evaluation, and link to materials is in the chat. Take care and have a nice day.